They saw heat on the scope, and it moved wrong. It didn't look like a man, and it didn't sound like an animal. At 2 in the morning, with night vision on and boots in the dirt, one small team of American soldiers found themselves staring through a thermal optic at something that should not have been there. The image was a smear of white among darker trees, a narrow vertical mass that tilted and stretched more like a limb than a torso. It moved with a speed that was too clean for a deer and too deliberate for a human. Then it answered them, a low, guttural sound that hit in the chest the way no ordinary animal noise does, a vibration that made every trained listener freeze and measure distances they'd never been taught to guess. This is not folklore retold from tavern whispers. These are accounts shared by soldiers, men and women whose job is to read the world at night and to distinguish threat from non-threat. They describe remote training areas outside the towns on maps you can buy, forests that U.S. troops use for live fire exercises, recon runs, and long, sleepless nights. The title isn't a tease. Soldiers share horrifying secrets about the German forests. What follows are first-person recollections, corroborating details, and an attempt to place those memories beside the older, stranger stories that have lived in those same woods for centuries. If you like first-person military mysteries and want more of these reported encounters, subscribe for new episodes and documented testimonies. Germany hosts one of the most enduring American military footprints outside the United States. Tens of thousands of service members, families, and civilian contractors cycle through bases, training ranges, and live fire complexes across the country. Some of the largest training areas, remote, wooded, riddled with trails and old logging roads, exist precisely because they are sparse with human population and dense with cover. These places are perfect for realistic training. They force soldiers to operate in cold, dark, confusing environments where sensory input is limited and margins for error vanish. But those same characteristics that make the forests ideal for training also make them places where the unexpected feels amplified. Cold nights, fog that comes in drifts and settles like breath, the way tree lines swallow light, all of it changes perception. Night vision devices and thermal optics alter shapes into pools of gray and white. Exhaustion narrows attention. A faint sound can take on the weight of intention. These are the conditions under which the accounts you're about to hear were observed. Trained observers, worn by long hours and anxious to complete the mission, suddenly noticing something that did not fit. The first account comes from a soldier who was part of a recon sniper element operating in what the report labels as Grafenvor, probable Grafenwar.
He submitted his testimony under anonymity, like many veterans do when telling things that are uncomfortable to put plainly. He speaks in short, measured phrases, the kind of vocabulary you hear from people who habitually remove emotion from task reports. Still, the memory sits there. Thermal sight, white shape, growl. They were dropped off at dusk, a small element stacked into a ground mobile vehicle until the last stop. The road they left the vehicle on was mostly straight, a narrow paved line between thick stands of beech and spruce. Their assignment was simple in phrasing, but exacting in execution. Move to an overwatch position, use thermal to scan a known training lane, and report any movement. The weather was the kind that sits in your lungs, cold enough to make electronics fog. Not windy, but unsettled, the trees whispering without a clear direction. The team ran a standard formation. The witness remembers the familiar ritual of peering through an optic and trusting the rectangular green world of night vision. He explains the difference between NVGs, the helmet-mounted green gear that makes night a washed-out three-dimensional illusion, and the thermal scope on the sniper rifle, which renders heat as stark white on a black field. In the thermal, a sleeping fox and a warm engine glow feel equal until you shift focus. Military eyes learn the subtleties quickly. A human will present a certain heat signature, a dog another, and vehicles will stripe and block in characteristic ways. What he saw did not match any of those signatures. At first, the thermal image looked like a human silhouette, thin and hunched. Then the silhouette straightened in a way that was anatomically wrong. The torso lengthened, limbs thinned, joints moved with too many degrees of freedom. It was pale white against the darker tree trunks, the kind of white that, on a thermal, suggests concentrated heat, but its outline was narrow and too vertical, like someone elongated. The movement wasn't random. It scanned, with an almost attentive quality, as if checking sectors and listening. That was the first red flag in his mind. It behaved like an observer. They pushed forward, the recon team on edge but still professional. When they closed to a clearing, The night changed. The soldier remembers a smell, old frost, wet leaves, and then the sound, a low sound that he cannot cleanly define in everyday words. He says growl because there is nothing better. It was a sound that had a throatiness like a large carnivore and a resonance like something blowing through a deep pipe. It came from the tree line, and crucially, it responded to their movement with intentionality. The optic captured a burst of motion, long limbs uncoiling and the shape vanishing into the forest at a speed that outpaced even their sprint. They chased, because you chase what you can identify, and you chase what threatens your mission. The team followed for several minutes on rough footing.
Their radios were the soft noise in the background. Check-ins, coordinate calls, the clipped language of operations. Then the thing stopped, as if waiting, and the forest answered. Something huge and hollow filled the space with a vocalization that pressed against their chests and radio pieces rattle against collarbone. The team held position. They had a standard operating procedure for contact: assess, don't engage unless necessary, command might order withdrawal. This felt like both. By the time they fell back to the vehicle, the team's log recorded an anomalous sighting. A pale, gaunt figure, seen briefly on thermal, moving in ways inconsistent with human gait, emitting a deep sound. Word spread within the unit by the morning shift. A second patrol confirmed seeing a similar vertical thermal spike at the same tree line earlier that night. Another element reported tracks too wide and too deep for a regular boot, though those prints were later found to be partial and degraded. The anonymous soldier is careful with his language. He doesn't claim this was supernatural. He notes that the object could have been an animal he'd never learned to identify, or even a misinterpreted human who moved oddly because of terrain or injury. He also insists that the sound they heard was not a typical wolf bark or boar grunting. Someone else in the unit, a radioed corroborator whose call sign the witness won't allow to be used publicly, said the noise felt intentional. That word recurs in multiple accounts. These are not simply passing animals. Witnesses consistently describe behavior that suggests awareness of the observers. There are reasons why soldiers' reports are often returned to silence. Within military culture, admitting to being frightened can be an operational hazard. Careers depend on reliability. Performance evaluations and security clearances reward steadiness. Reports that include ambiguous phenomena often enter a binary choice in leadership: sanitize the language into a mundane incident log to prevent panic, or escalate with a formal safety report that draws scrutiny and paperwork. In this case, the unit elected to keep the formal log simple: an unknown thermal contact, no engagement. The informal ledger, the kind of message passed over beers and in barracks at 03 a.m., carried more detail. That is how these stories spread inside units, not in official archives, but in the hushed circulation of veterans who trade moments that didn't fit conventional explanation. That's only the start of the pattern. A repeated theme in these testimonies is the interplay between instrumentation and interpretation. Night vision and thermal devices do not produce faithful photographic records the way daylight cameras do. They produce interpretations of heat, movement, and contrast. When a soldier trained to read certain heat signatures sees something that breaks pattern, their reaction is to default to the training protocol.
But after that, memory becomes the medium. Memory is rougher, sharpened at the edges by emotional weight. The anonymous recon team's recollection emphasizes that trained operators, not civilians, were the observers, a detail meant to lend credibility, not sensationalism. These are people who have learned to differentiate friend from foe at a glance. Their claim that the sight felt wrong counts as a significant datum. Within days, a few other soldiers from adjacent units mentioned similar sightings. Not all accounts matched exactly. One described a creature that moved primarily on hind limbs and stood like a man, while another described a low ground-crawling silhouette that slithered between tree trunks. Shared descriptors emerged: pallid heat signature, elongated limbs, unusual gait, and an acoustic element, a low, resonant noise that witnesses use words like growl or throb to describe. Because these reports come from people whose work is to attend to danger, the repetition demands a careful listening. That repetition opens the door to a small but painful question. How do you reconcile technical evidence with folklore? How do you listen to trained observation while knowing the mind fills gaps? The first task is never to leap to a metaphysical explanation. The second task is not to dismiss experienced observers who claim their instruments and senses affirmed something out of the ordinary. There is an established motif in modern anomalous reportage that scholars sometimes call the pale crawler or rake archetype, a shorthand that circulates among enthusiasts and military witnesses alike. It describes a creature that is unnaturally thin, pale and thermal,
moves quickly and with a jerky symmetry, and sometimes exhibits a preference for the edges of forested clearings. Stories of the pale crawler have appeared in accounts from different countries, although details shift with culture and language. Some narrators emphasize the creature's speed, others its unearthly silence, or the empty, human-like posture it adopts when visible. Cross-cultural comparisons are useful in showing how certain sensory stimuli, a narrow silhouette in low visibility, can be narrated in similar ways across places and times. They are not, however, proof that the same entity stalks different forests. The recon sniper report sits at a difficult intersection: instrument readings, trained witness testimony, and the cultural resonance of older stories. And it points toward a familiar pattern in reports from American forces stationed in Europe. Events that occur at night in unfamiliar terrain tend to collect more than just a single description. They attract corroborating tales, they generate local legends, and they place soldiers in a liminal space between military procedure and the histories that lie in the very soil of their training areas.
The Grafenvor report, as we'll call it here, using the name the witness provided, did something else. It stirred curiosity among the soldiers who'd grown up in adjacent towns and among the local German civilians whose families had lived in those woods for generations. Soldiers began to trade not only their own short clinical sketches, but also local myths. At the center of many of those myths is the idea that the forest is alive in a way that can confuse or hurt outsiders. This is not an exclusively German idea. Woodlands have been repositories of fear and reverence across Europe for ages. What's important for the military context is that these legends create an interpretive frame for unusual events. When a soldier hears a story about a pale thing, the next time the thermal returns an anomaly, the story is already waiting to lend its language. The recon witness mentions one phrase that stuck with him: they keep quiet after dark. That suggestion, that locals avoid certain places after sunset, is a recurring detail in multiple accounts we examined. It functions on two levels. Practically, it explains why witnesses are sometimes the soldiers themselves. Few locals patrol deep training ranges at night, but soldiers must. Culturally, it implies a tacit agreement between people and place. This portion of the forest has its own rules and its own dangers, and the unwritten rule is to respect them by staying away. The recon team's encounter ended without a body, without a clear trace, and only partial confirmation in degraded tracks. That lack of physical evidence separates these episodes from ordinary wildlife incidents and pushes them into a liminal archive of memory and rumor. Yet absence of hard evidence does not mean absence of significance. What followed the Grafenvor sighting was a subtle behavioral shift among some soldiers: more cautious movement in certain sectors, avoidance of lone observation posts, and in some instances a reluctance to log detailed thermal anomalies, lest the report trigger an unwanted chain of administrative scrutiny. What can explain a sighting like the one described at Grafenvor? Several hypotheses circulate among analysts and veterans, and they try to balance empirical caution with imaginative openness. One possibility is that the team observed a known animal under unusual circumstances. A deer or boar reflected oddly in thermal when caught at a particular angle, or an infirm human who moved atypically. Another is that the team witnessed an animal not native to the immediate area, for instance, a large canid with a coat or condition that altered its thermal profile. Wolves have returned to parts of Germany in recent decades, and their presence sometimes confuses expectations. A more troubling possibility is human agency, people who roam the forest at night for reasons that could range from illicit shelter to violent intent. Finally, there is the cultural overlay. If soldiers expect certain imagery, their memories may assemble ambiguous inputs into a compelling narrative. None of these explanations fully accounts for every detail: the repeated reports of an odd gait, the low acoustic vibration, and the impression of an observing intelligence. That is precisely why many soldiers choose to tell their stories off the record and in restrained terms. Saying, "we saw something," is safer, career-wise, than hypothesizing a werewolf. Yet the tension between procedural reticence and the compulsion to share shapes how these narratives spread. An important valve in the spread of such stories is corroboration from local authorities. In some instances, soldiers reported that local police or forest officials, a forestmeister, the person responsible for woods management, had been involved in searches. Those local authorities often operate under different cultural pressures. Their mandate is to keep communities safe, preserve forest land, and regulate hunting. When they become part of an incident, the narrative acquires another layer of institutional response. Soldiers who reported the Grafenvor sighting say that local forestry personnel visited the range in the daylight, scanned areas, and found nothing conclusive. In other cases, slightly different. They found prints, shredded vegetation, or animal remains inconsistent with standard predation.
Those findings complicate any attempt at a tidy explanation, but also illustrate a common pattern, evidence that is ambiguous enough to be explained away and yet vivid enough to create unease. After the recon team's report circulated within their unit, it also started cropping up in casual conversations with veterans from other installations. The language shifted and pooled. The phrase pale crawler became a sorting tag, a shorthand that trainees used to designate a certain kind of night sighting they'd heard whispered about in mess halls. It's worth noting that the label itself carries a ghost of internet-age folklore. Terms like rake and pale crawler have been circulating on forums and in creepypasta narratives for years. That infiltration of online myth-making into real-world testimony presents a methodological challenge. A soldier who has read an online account could describe a sighting with the same vocabulary as someone who has never been online, especially if the words have been shared inside military circles. Disentangling independent, contemporary observation from those influenced by cultural memes requires careful interviewing and corroborating evidence. Which brings us back to the original witness. He insists their unit never used the online language. They described what they saw the way they would any event, factual, sparing, focused on measurable variables.
Yet when asked later about the broader pattern of similar accounts, he conceded that soldiers do exchange stories, and that the stories took on an aura, particularly among those who had to move through the forest at night. The presence of a shared vocabulary does not erase the core experience, it only complicates how we understand the testimony. By dawn, the Grafenvor team had changed how they conducted certain patrols. They cleared sectors more cautiously, they avoided single-man posts at the edges of training lanes, and they filed a terse, formal report that reduced the night's oddities to a line item. Unknown thermal contact observed, no engagement. Recommend increased situational awareness. That recommendation is the kind of bureaucratic language engineered to be non-committal. It preserves operational security while acknowledging that something unexpected occurred. For soldiers, that kind of documentation can be unsatisfying. It leaves personal unease unresolved and encourages informal storytelling as a coping mechanism. One small human moment after the incident stands out in the witness's memory. A private, back in the barracks, lighting a cigarette outside a window that looked toward the tree line. He told the witness there was an old woman in the village near the range who, when asked about why no one went into certain parts of the woods after sunset, simply said, "We leave that alone." That concise local refusal, a cultural interdiction couched in pragmatic terms, may be nothing more than tradition, or it may be a cultural memory of a past violence, a taboo, or simply a communal boundary. Whatever the case, it affected the way soldiers processed the sighting. The forest became not merely a neutral training ground, but a place with social history, a place that might conceal stories, and possibly dangers. As the light rose on the day after the sighting, the recon team's members returned to routine. The senior NCO framed the incident to higher command with the same procedural carefulness one sees in many military units. They registered the observation, suggested monitoring, and emphasized there was no immediate threat to personnel. The message that made its way to the unit's less formal channels, however, was the one with the edges sharpened by the night. Something was there, something that moved wrong, something that made trained soldiers stop and listen. We can pause here and consider what that retention, the way soldiers transform formal reports into personal testimonies, tells us. First, there is the institutional imperative to neutralize anomalies rather than elevate them publicly. Second, there is the human imperative to narrate and thereby to soothe the cognitive dissonance that comes from seeing something one cannot easily categorize. Third, there is the cultural overlay. The mythic frameworks locals bring to the same terrain often seep into the soldiers' interpretations, whether through casual encounters with villagers or through the interiorization of place-based warnings. The Grafenvor account, with its thermal imprint and bone-deep growl, offers a clear example of how a single night can create a ripple. A team moves through a clearing, an anomalous thermal signature appears, trained observers respond, a low sound reverberates, the team retreats, formal documentation is cautious, the barracks retelling is more graphic, local lore frames the event. That chain creates the conditions for a story to take on a life beyond the moment, to persist, to be recounted, to merge with other narratives that will be told around heaters, on rotations, and in late-night calls home. It is important to emphasize caution here. Many plausible, non-monstrous explanations may account for parts of the account. Equipment quirks, odd heat reflections, a diseased animal, or even deliberate human activity. But the detail that recurs across independent testimonies is not merely a misreading of thermal data. It is the consistency of certain sensory impressions, elongated form, unusual movement, and an acoustic element that listeners describe as spontaneously resonant. That triad is what pushes some stories beyond the category of equipment malfunction and into something that soldiers remember with a peculiar, lingering intensity. As the sun climbed higher and the forest returned to its day rhythm,
The team members went about the rest of their duties. Yet the memory of the thermal white lingered, a vertical sliver of heat disappearing into trees that held older stories. Soldiers are trained to bear uncertainty and to act with ambiguity. What we have in this account is not a definitive answer, but an honest report that intersects with equipment readings, human perception, and local cultural signifiers. It is also the first thread in a strand of testimonies that, when woven together, reveal a larger pattern of unsettling reports from soldiers stationed across Germany. That pattern is what we will continue to trace. There are accounts that echo the Grafenvor event in key ways, and there are others that shift the scene from the deep dark of a training range to the edge of a village, a hostel balcony, a small town where human stories and older legends meet. Those stories bring police records, forest officials, and local silence into the frame. They also introduce footprints that didn't make sense, and deer found dead under circumstances that didn't match known predation. Each of these elements is a piece of the larger puzzle, trained witnesses encountering anomalous phenomena in sites where history and nature and military life converge.
So we leave the Grafenvor forest and its white thermal signature for now, keeping its specific details close. Thermal scope, elongated silhouette, low resonant sound, corroboration within the unit, and a formal log that favors brevity. Ahead lies another account, different in setting but similar in its capacity to unsettle, that brings a veteran named Richard into a small town setting where a balcony view, local lore, and a footprint larger than expected combine into another unresolved episode. We will move there next, and with it the layers of village tradition and official response that complicate any attempt at a neat explanation. Richard remembers the hostile smell first, cheap coffee, wet wool, and the kind of heating that rattles in old pipes. It was late winter, and the town sat under a thin, hard sky. He'd been in Germany for rotations and language training, billeted in a small guest house that catered to soldiers passing through. His window faced the street, and beyond that a slope of trees that rose toward a ridge the locals avoided after dusk. The name the witness used in his report is Nunnestein. Probable, Nunnestein, needs verification, and the nearby village the witness called Schwano. Probable, Schwano, needs verification. Both names echo in multiple accounts with slight spelling differences. What matters for Richard's story is not the on-paper place name, but the way the town's history seemed to press against the present. He had been listening to the older men at the hostel trade folklore. They talked about shape-changers and strange nights the way people in cold towns talk about floods, as things that happen to someone else but are plausible enough to merit attention. That night, Richard and a small group went out to a beer hall and then back to the hostel, laughing at the mountain of legends with the same kind of irony that soldiers use to keep fear organized. On a whim, he stepped onto the balcony to smoke and to clear his head before bed. The street sounded ordinary. Muted tires, a distant dog, a clock chime. Then he noticed a figure near the tree line. At first he assumed a hunter. The slope was a place hunters used, and hunters move differently than civilians. But this did not move like a man with a rifle. It stood too tall, and its silhouette was suggestive of a canine head set on two straight shoulders. It tilted its head in a way that read as attention rather than aim. Richard watched, and at close range, perhaps 30 meters, maybe less, he could see the animal's ears caught in the light, long, pointed, oddly erect. He called down to his companions. They laughed, called him superstitious, and then the local host, an older woman who spoke with the clipped cadence of someone who'd lived the whole of her life in that valley, stepped outside. She did not offer jokes. Instead, she stared toward the tree line and said, in German, that people kept their doors bolted in a way they didn't talk about after dark.
Her words made the hair on Richard's arms prickle. The hostel manager offered to call the police. The men in the group, half wanting to see the reaction and half not, shrugged and let her. The first officers to arrive were local constables, accompanied by a forestmeister, the official charged with the condition and use of local woodlands. Their search that night was methodical but constrained. They scoured the slope with flashlights, their beams sliding over bracken and roots, their footsteps precise. They found nothing that immediately explained the figure. No rifle, no lantern, no sleeping bag. They did, however, discover a single impression in a muddy patch near the ridge's feeder path, a print that did not match the town's usual boot sizes and was too deep for the recent soil. The print's heel was indistinct, as though something with long toes had pressed and then withdrawn. The constables photographed the impression and fenced it in with tape the following morning. The image of that print, large, splayed, and oddly narrow, traveled by word of mouth. Richard remembers that the printed dimensions the officers recorded were difficult to reconcile with a known species, too long and narrow for a human boot, too long for a fox or badger, and bearing a semblance of a long curved toe rather than a hoof or typical pad. The Forestmeister said aloud in the public record that they could not immediately identify the source. Yet the same report that described a baffling print also included boilerplate sentences intended to soothe the public. There was no immediate danger, livestock and residents were safe. That tension, the official calm next to an unidentified sign, is a recurrent pattern in these testimonies. What unsettled Richard was not only the sighting, but the reaction of the townspeople afterward. Locals, when asked directly, were curt. The older woman at the hostel smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and told them, half joking, "We have stories here." She would not elaborate on where those stories came from. Another neighbor, a hunter who had lived on those slopes for decades, refused to return to the ridge after sunset. He had seen prints before, he said, and did not press the point. The town, by the morning after the sighting, had resumed its routine, but a quiet had settled over certain routes and fields. Richard's encounter, unlike the recon teams, happened within a community context. The presence of local authorities and their partial documentation framed it as more than a private oddity. But the documentation was itself ambivalent. Official logs contain the kind of language that mitigates liability and public alarm. Unknown animal track observed, no immediate threat. In the hallway of the police station, a clerk later told a soldier that the matter had been noted and closed because there was no tangible danger and no clear evidence of criminal intent.
For soldiers used to strict chains of command, that bureaucratic closure felt like a soft erasure. The footprint found near the ridge was preserved as a photograph and then cited in conversation as weird. For Richard, the footprint mattered because it suggested the presence of an animal or person at a scale that didn't fit convenient categories. It didn't mean anything definite, and Richard would not leap to say it proved a werewolf, but it did make the line between legend and observation blur. Soldiers who spend nights in foreign landscapes already carry a list of unknowns. Adding the town's unspoken interdictions amplified that list. Like the Grafenvor incident, Richard's sighting traveled backward into history. A local archivist, when pressed, mentioned a 19th-century tale the villagers told at market, a man accused of monstrous cruelty who vanished into the woods, and whose legend grew into a warning to children. That story, in turn, functioned like a cultural sediment layer. It lent explanation to the view from a balcony, and it made a small result, one print, one figure at the edge of trees, feel like part of a larger continuity. Historians caution against reading such folklore as direct evidence of current events. The proper way to treat these narratives as interpretive tools, they reveal how communities make sense of violent or anomalous occurrences by folding them into pre-existing frameworks. There's no neat resolution to Richard's night. He went back to his duties, he kept the photograph of the print on his phone for a long time, scrolling past it on flights and quarters, wondering if someone with better gear would give a straight answer. The police file remained short. Locals told soldiers to avoid the ridge at night. The story persisted in rotation room anecdotes, in the small way the forest silhouette pressed against memory. Richard's account amplifies a key feature of these reports. Encounters often occur where community knowledge and military procedure intersect. That intersection complicates response. Local officials worry about tourism and property values. Military leaders worry about readiness and rumor. Individuals, meanwhile, carry an unresolved image in their heads. From the balcony of a hostel to the perimeter lights of an airbase, the Third Corps account moves us from civilian borders back into a security sphere. The late 1980s incidents around Han ABF and what veterans called the Moorbach monster. The witness who submitted the Han ABF account used the call sign Sierra 7, a desk and patrol veteran of the 50th Security Police Squadron. Like others, Sierra 7 requested anonymity for reasons that were familiar: career risk, personal privacy, and the discomfort of reporting something that challenged basic operational assumptions. Sierra 7's recollection begins with a detail that, on its face, sounds mundane, but becomes significant in context: a roadside shrine at the edge of a small town near the base.
The shrine had an eternal flame, in reality a candle or a small lamp that locals maintained, and soldiers sometimes paused there on late-night drives as a ritual or dare. On one such occasion in the late 1980s, a group of airmen pulled off the road and joked at the shrine's candles, laughing about superstitions and swapping stories. They left, half amused, and shortly after noticed deer carcasses near the base's perimeter, not the kind of roadkill or common predation you would expect. The animals were found with wounds inconsistent with simple collision or natural predator patterns. Sierra 7's team treated the discovery as a possible security issue. A fence breach had to be investigated. The base's security response followed standard procedure: log the incident, check perimeter lighting, sweep the area with patrols, and control local access. What the patrols found was unusual. One of the perimeter teams encountered a large biped-shaped figure, seen briefly on a service road near a darkened section of fence. The silhouette, the witness said, appeared to stand on two legs in a manner that resembled a human posture, but with proportions that were off. The patrol recorded the encounter in a confidential log. A possible humanoid contact, no engagement due to unknown threat. A senior NCO later shredded this account to a simpler line in a higher-level report. Animal sighting, no danger to personnel. That sanitization, the decision to recode an anomalous contact as something mundane, is a theme that runs through multiple military testimonies. The reasons for it range from protecting operational readiness to avoiding unauthorized investigation that could endanger untrained personnel. Sierra 7 remembers the deer specifically because, in the patrol's experience, predators left telltale patterns, gnaw marks in particular places, bite patterns that suggested canet feeding. What they observed at the perimeter contradicted those patterns. Wounds were precise and localized. Internal injuries suggested a different feeding dynamic than a simple scavenging. Soldiers, trained in pattern recognition for security work, found the body patterns inconsistent with normal wildlife behavior. A veterinarian consulted the following morning, according to Sierra 7, remarked that it looked atypical, but could not confirm intent without further forensic inspection. An inspection that did not happen with the thoroughness some patrol members wanted because of resource constraints and public relations concerns. What complicates the Han AFB story is the administrative pressure on base leadership. Security personnel feared that formalizing a narrative of an unknown humanoid on base would draw intense scrutiny from both command and public media. There were career implications. There were also operational ones. A report that implied a person or unknown actor was breaching a perimeter suggested a lapse in security.
In such settings, witness testimony is often weighed against command priorities. The patrols filed reports that were gradually reframed by successive levels of command into a sanitized incident. Animal-related damage, area secured. The informal ledger within the squadron, however, preserved a different memory. Men who saw an upright figure and returned to tell it in the dim peace of a locker room. Sierra 7's account also touches on another pattern emerging from these reports, a ritualistic response among soldiers that mixes gallows humor with quieter acts of reverence. The shrine at the roadside, the candle left by locals, became a symbol in squadron lore, a small place where airmen joked and then sometimes where they left a token. Humor was an adaptive response, so was a cautious avoidance of certain sectors. Patrol patterns shifted. Extra lights were requested in areas where the men felt uneasy. Officers logged equipment checks and mandated two-man patrols in shadowed stretches of fence. These behavioral changes are significant because they show how an anomalous sighting can produce operational shifts without producing publicly transparent documentation. Sierra 7 also noted that some officers discouraged excessive speculation. The official message, repeated in roll calls and staff meetings, stressed calm. Keep reports factual, stick to standard reporting channels, and avoid sharing unverified accounts outside the chain of command. For many enlisted personnel, that felt like an admonition to close ranks around uncertainty. The post-incident culture, part joke, part restraint, is another way these stories persist. They do not always disappear into redacted logs. They circulate in mess halls, they are tattooed into routine, and they alter daylight behavior in subtle ways. Alongside these operational narratives, reports emerged of deer carcasses discovered on private lands adjacent to training areas and bases. Local hunters and farmers sometimes discovered animals with patterns of bleeding and tissue removal that did not fit known predator signatures. In several cases, forensic veterinarians and police officers noted that cuts were surgically precise in ways that suggested human tool use, or that internal organs were missing without classic signs of scavenger activity. Investigations were often cursory because resources for full necropsies were limited and because the police had competing priorities. That patchwork of attention fueled speculation in both soldier and civilian communities. Again, the key methodological caution applies. These findings are startling but ambiguous, and ambiguity invites a wide range of explanatory models. From Grafenvohr to Nunnestein to Han AFB, a pattern emerges. Trained observers report anomalies. Local authorities sometimes corroborate strange signs. Military administration often neutralizes the language of reports, and folklore circulates in the background as a cultural interpretive frame.
The pattern raises the question historians and folklorists have wrestled with for centuries. How do communities rationalize violence that exceeds ordinary categories? The answer is never singular, but history supplies instructive parallels. Two historical narratives repeatedly appear when locals and veterans try to contextualize modern sightings. The story associated with Thomas Schweitzer,
also spelled Schweitzer in older sources, and the trial records tied to a man known in the 16th century as Peter Stump. Presenting these cases does not prove a supernatural continuity. Instead, they offer a way of understanding how real human violence and social panic have historically been transmuted into tales of beasts. Thomas Schweitzer's narrative, as recorded in local chronicles and later retellings, is a composite of rumor's magnification, and archival gaps. In some tellings, he is described as a deserter or a man accused of brutal acts who fled into the woods and whose return triggered fear among villagers. In others, the contours are emphatically human, a person living on the margins, committing crimes, then evading capture in the forest's seclusion. Over time, the figure in stories assumed attributes consistent with monstrous transformation, a process scholars call mythopoiesis, which fills the blanks historical records leave behind. Scholars who examine the Schweitzer stories caution that while some elements may reflect real crimes, later retellings likely amplified those crimes and reframed them through the symbolic language of beasts and curses. The narrative functions socially. It explains unexplainable violence by giving it a figure that communities can both fear and narrate. Peter Stump's case has a different archival shape. Records from the 16th century witch-hunting era show legal processes where accusations of lycanthropy, transformation into wolves, were intermingled with accusations of homicide, robbery, or moral deviance. Trials occasionally centered on a person alleged to have killed during nocturnal wanderings, and the legal language of the time allowed supernatural framing, contract with the devil, transformation, and so on. Modern historians reading Stump's case interpret it within the broader socio-political context of early modern Europe, periods of religious zeal, social instability, and courts that frequently used extraordinary frameworks to make sense of crime. What looks monstrous in the chronicles may often reveal social mechanisms of control, scapegoating, or the projection of community anxieties onto certain individuals. Both historical threads show a crucial point. Violent acts, whether human or animal, often attract supernatural framing when communities lack satisfactory explanations. Werewolf legends in this reading operate as cultural tools to incorporate and narrate violence that resists ordinary comprehension. They should not be taken as literal evidence for literal transformations.
Rather, they illuminate how memory and interpretation work. That historical lens matters for interpreting soldiers' modern accounts. When veterans and locals invoke werewolves or shape-changers, they are not necessarily claiming the literal metamorphosis described in medieval chronicles. Instead, they are using a culturally loaded metaphor to make sense of ambiguous events, a figure that behaves with predatory intelligence, that stands at the boundary between human and animal, that appears at night and leaves odd traces. Folklore provides language, technology provides data. Both interact in the stories soldiers tell. So what are the plausible, concrete explanations for these multiple reports? The inventory is long, and a responsible appraisal acknowledges uncertainty while enumerating possibilities. Canids and reintroduced predators. Wolves have indeed returned to parts of Germany over the last several decades. Wolves behave differently from foxes and domestic dogs. They can travel in packs, they may scavenge in unusual patterns, and their presence can explain some carcass findings. A wolf with mange or another disease could present an unusual thermal signature or an odd gait. Misidentification under instrumentation and fatigue. Night vision and thermal devices transform reality into contrast maps. A human crouched behind brush can look elongated in thermal. A person wearing layered clothing or a backpack can appear to have odd silhouette geometry. Exhaustion, stress, and confirmational bias, seeing what your story expects, amplify misidentification risk. Human activity. Trespassers, illicit hunters, or violent actors operating in the woods could account for strange footprints, mutilated carcasses, and deliberate staging designed to provoke fear. Cut patterns on animals could reflect human butchery rather than a creature's feeding. Scavenger behavior and environmental factors. Scavengers sometimes remove tissue in ways that appear surgical, especially when environmental conditions accelerate decomposition. Incomplete necropsies or delayed reporting further confuse the forensic picture. Hoaxes and folklore circulation. Once a story enters military circles or local taverns, imitative behavior can produce staged scenes meant to frighten or gain attention. The internet's folklore economy intensifies this. Mimetic terms like pale crawler migrate from forums into oral accounts, shaping how witnesses describe anomalies. Psychological contagion and cultural priming. For soldiers living on rotations, stories spread quickly. A shared vocabulary primes observers to assemble ambiguous inputs into the pre-existing frame, producing similar descriptions across independent witnesses. Each of these explanations fits part of the dataset, but none cleanly accounts for every reported detail. That is the heart of the problem. Ambiguity is the actual phenomenon.
The responsible interpreter is compelled to weigh each possibility, examine the evidence chain, and resist the temptation to offer a single spectacular cause. Institutional practices matter too. Military protocols around reporting can produce both omission and alteration. Personnel fear administrative consequences. The visibility of a report can trigger public attention, investigations, and career complications. For instance, the Personnel Reliability Program implications, where unexplained incidents could trigger psychological evaluation or career review, create incentives to sanitize reports. Command-level decisions that recast an event as an animal sighting rather than an unknown humanoid contact reflect a conservative approach. Preserve order, control narrative, and avoid provoking fear that might harm operational effectiveness. Local government considerations also play a role. For a town whose economy depends on tourism, official confirmation of a violent predator or a serial human threat can be ruinous, hence the temptation to emphasize mundane explanations. In sum, the administrative and cultural incentives in both military and civilian spheres shape not only what gets reported, but how reports are recorded and remembered. Despite these pressures, some acts of documentation endure. Photographs, radio logs, and veterinarian reports, even when partial, provide anchor points. In several cases within the corpus we examined, evidence was preserved. Photographs of prints, patrol logs that hinted at unusual contacts, and witness statements, though anonymized, remained internally consistent. Those anchors are valuable precisely because they coexist with ambiguity. They allow investigators to triangulate, to collate patterns across time and place, without leaping to sensational conclusions. There is also a moral dimension to consider. The people at the center of these accounts are soldiers and civilians who felt something they could not explain, who then bore the double burden of fear and the choice to speak or remain silent. When veterans share these memories years later, they are often seeking validation, or at least a sympathetic listener who will not convert their unease into ridicule. The ethical posture of anyone engaging these accounts should be one of careful listening, non-judgment, and a commitment to accuracy. If there is a practical takeaway for those who serve in similar environments today, it is this: stay procedural, document thoroughly, and preserve evidence. Photography with time-stamped metadata, careful necropsy when animals are found, and transparent channels for reporting unanomalous contacts help disentangle misidentification from genuine threats. At the same time, commanders and local leaders should acknowledge the psychological impact of unexplained incidents and offer support that does not stigmatize those who report fear.
As night folds into day in these stories, an image returns. That first white smear on a thermal screen, the head tilt at the tree line, the single strange print pressed into mud, the deer discovered with internal injuries that didn't fit routine patterns. Those images persist because they possess an undecidability that refuses neat classification. Soldiers carry those images as part of their service memory. Locals fold them into cautionary tales. Historians fold them into patterns of how societies narrate violence. The title that opened this conversation, Soldiers Share Horrifying Secrets About the German Forests, is not mere sensationalism. It names a phenomenon. Trained observers recounting anomalous experiences in environments where history, folklore, and tactical necessity converge. They tell stories not to mystify, but to register that for them, something in the night did not make sense. Whether that something is an animal shifted by ecological change, a human actor with violent intent, a misread thermal oddity, or a confluence of cultural priming and stress, is the question that demands careful investigation, not conclusion. In the quiet places where soldiers still patrol and villagers still avoid certain slopes after dark, the stories keep moving. They change names. They enter mess hall lore. They resurface in late-night emails from veterans. They teach a practical lesson as much as they thrill a curiosity. Pay attention, document thoroughly, and respect the boundaries that communities set, whether those boundaries are founded in pragmatic caution or in stories that have lived for generations. One final detail, small and stubborn. A veteran who had been in the Grafenvor team later swore that months after his initial sighting, while on leave near a different training area, he heard a low, sustained sound in the tree line that matched the growl he had first described. It was far enough away that he could not see, only hear, and it resonated in a way that made his chest tighten the way grief does. He did not press on it in reports. There was nowhere formal to lodge a sound. He told it to a friend over coffee, and they both fell silent. That silence, not denial, but a pause in which the memory sat like a stone, is the recurring note in many of these testimonies. We cannot close with certainty. We can only note that the combination of trained observation, ambiguous physical signs, local folklore, and administrative pressure creates a distinctive space, one where soldiers' reports of unusual forest encounters are credible as experiences, even if they remain indeterminate as explanations. Those reports deserve attention and care, not mockery or premature closure.
If these accounts resonate with you, whether as a veteran who has seen something in the dark or as a listener who wants deeper, documented investigations, leave your thoughts below and consider supporting long-form research that funds careful interviews and forensic follow-ups.
For now, what remains is the memory, a thermal dot that moved wrong, a head that tilted at the tree line, a footprint too strange to ignore. Soldiers tell these stories because they remember them. Listeners should take them seriously enough to investigate and cautiously enough to resist easy answers. They saw heat on their scopes, and it did not behave as it should. They heard a tone in the trees that made trained men still. The forests keep their secrets in trunks and root systems, in old paths, and in the hush that falls after a candle is put out. Whether those secrets are ecological, human, or something our categories do not yet hold, the one certainty is this: the stories stay with those who walked those woods and with those who listen. If you want more documented accounts and careful follow-up on reports like these, consider supporting our investigations. And if you have a sighting of your own, share it below so it can be recorded and examined with the care it deserves.